And now on the line is Roscommon historian and author of the book A Dictionary of Roscommon Biography that came out last year, Michael T. Lennon. Michael, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, Darren.
Okay, Michael, I recently bought your book that came out last year, a few weeks ago, for my father, whose birthday it was this week. It's a big book, and I understand that you spent a lot of time researching it and putting it together. Could you start off, Mike, by telling our listeners a bit about yourself, and then give me a bit of an overview of the book?
Okay. Well, about myself, I'm a native of Roscommon, Strokestown, and I after finishing Leaving Cert, I went to the United States, where I spent 10 years before returning, and since then I have been living in Dublin, working and living in Dublin, and I am retired now for several years. But before, I suppose about 10 years before I retired, I got interested in family history, and that led me into local history and about my own area around Strokestown, and one thing and another led to the idea then of doing, looking at all of the newspapers I was looking at and seeing all the obituaries. I was saying, well, all these will be forgotten. Perhaps there's a case for bringing them all together in one place, and hence the book came into being. And I suppose over 20 years I was constantly researching the local papers and anything that I could get a biography of people that had died and obituaries and so forth. And anyhow, by last year it had come to fruition, and I'm very happy with it indeed.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's amazing that you were working on it for 20 years. I know you do other work as well for Rosscommon. We'll come to that a bit later in the interview. We're just talking more about your book that came out last year. We're talking about this before the interview. You have you've included some people in the book that you personally have a particular interest in. You mentioned them, I said before the interview. The four of them you mentioned to me are William Wilde, Percy French, Betty Sugrue and Bridget Lyons Thornton. Do you want to tell me a bit about first who William Wilde was?
Well, William Wilde would be best known to your listeners as the father of Oscar Wilde. And William was born in Castlerea, and he was educated in Elphin, in Roscommon, in a school that was founded in 1700. And it was, I suppose, at that stage it was a school for the wealthy and the well-off, and I suppose you could call it a feeder school for Trinity College at the time. One of the other illustrious graduates was Oliver Goldsmith in that particular school. But anyhow, William went on to study medicine, and he became very well known as an eye and ear specialist, and he founded his own hospital in Dublin. And but then he became very well known, and he published lots of noted articles, and he ended up being knighted in 1864. And of course, he married his wife Jane Francesca, who was an author herself and wrote under the pen name Speranza. And of course, they had their son Oscar. He had a few illegitimate children as well, who turned out to be fairly notable as well. But he was also a statistician, an archaeologist, and an antiquarian. So he had a wide range of interests. He was a prominent member of the Royal Irish Academy, and he lived in Merrion Square, where obviously the statue of Oscar is still there in Merrion Square to be seen, just opposite the corner that they lived in. I think there's an American college there or something at the moment. So anyhow, he was an interesting Castlerea man, where he was born. So I thought he was an interesting guy with several areas that he was very much an expert in.
Okay, that's cool, yeah. And the next person you mentioned to me, Percy French. The name sounds familiar. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, Percy French would be one of the best known Roscommon people, I suppose. Douglas Hyde, the first president, would be another one, but Percy may be even better known. Percy was born in Clooney Quinn, which is near Tusk, and his branch of the French family. The French family originally were a Norman family that came into Wexford, and then from there they branched out and ended up in Galway, and they were one of the tribes of Galway. And but in the land in the Cromwellian land distribution period of the mid 1600s, the French family got a big holding in Roscommon, in French Park, which is named after them. And I suppose the lesser part of the family were the Clooney Quinn branch. But Percy was a son who went on to Trinity, and he had some earlier. He had a private tutor, and he was educated in England. But he came back to Trinity, but he started an engineering degree, which it took him a long time to qualify, because he was spending a lot of his time in the entertainment world, writing and I suppose having a good time. His first song that he wrote that he published was Abdullah Bulbul Amir, and apparently in the 1880s it was a big hit, but he forgot to copyright it and never got a penny for it. But that taught him a lesson afterwards. So he went on anyhow to be employed by the Board of Works, and he was a surveyor of drains in County Cavan, and he wrote songs and did a lot of painting as well. He was a very good painter, and his songs are very well known now. The Mountains of Morton and Come Home, Paddy Riley, and Phil the Fluter, and Are You Right There, Michael, and lots of songs that are still popular. Unfortunately, he never wrote a song about Roscommon, even though he was back and forth and visited the family home quite a bit. But he never got Roscommon into a song. And he toured. He was touring a lot in England, and he died in Liverpool. But his daughters returned to Roscommon afterwards, and there were several festivals and celebrations, and the landmark Percy French Hotel in Strokestown is called after him. So he is remembered still. But a very well-known Roscommon guy.
Yeah, I know that song. You're right there, Mike. You're right. It's a good song.
Yeah.
We have two more people on the list to go through. This woman, she's certainly an interesting character. I was reading about her last night. Betty Sugrue, I believe, is her name.
Betty Sugrue, yeah, not quite a different character than the other two gentlemen we talked about. As I say, she ended up in Roscommon after a hard time, and the story goes her period was 1750 to 1807 was her lifespan, but she ended up in Roscommon and had a son with whom she had a falling out, and he left and went to America. And many years later, when she was much older, he returned, but he didn't. He had a beard and was completely changed, and she didn't recognize him, as the story goes. But she used to give people lodgings at the time, so he stayed with her for the night. But she reckoned he was rich and had money, and apparently murdered him, killed him. And she was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, and that was in the late 1700s, around the time of the 1798 rebellion. So there was the day she was that was appointed for her hanging. there were a few other gentlemen who apparently were involved in the rising at the time, also scheduled to be hung. And the day arrived and the morning arrived, but the executioner didn't show up. So she saw an opportunity, and she offered to do the job of the gentleman, provided she was spared. And her sentence of death still hung over her for a few years, but she continued to do the job of executioner. And the jail in Roscommon is still there on the main square, and the particular window where the platform was is cemented up now, but it's people know where it is. She continued, of course. She had to live in the jail because she wasn't particularly liked because of her job, and so they protected her by keeping her in the jail. And when she died, she was buried, and nobody knows where she was buried, because if the grave was, well, I mean, the grave could be desecrated, I suppose, is the word you would put on it, if it was known. But an unusual lady executioner.
She sounds like someone who'd be in a star actor in a horror film or something.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely.
The last person on the list, Bridget Lyons Thornton. She's also another interesting character. She was, but she's a lot more positive light. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, she had a much more positive lifestyle and life story than Betty Sugrue. She was born in Scramog, which is just between Longford and Strokestown on the N5. But her mother died when she was very young, at 2 years old, and she was brought to her uncle's shop. Her uncle Frank McGuinness had a shop in Longford. And Frank was born in Roscommon, though, and his brother Joe in Tarmanbarry, and she was reared in Longford and went to school there, and went to school in Sligo, and then went on to study medicine in UCG in Galway. But she became involved with the Cumann na Món, and when the rising happened in 1916. She was in Dublin at the time, and she was very much involved in helping the wounded in the forecourts. And she was arrested afterwards and spent some time in Kilmainham jail, but went back to Galway and continued her studies. Later, then in the 1920 or thereabouts, she came back to Dublin, and she was very much involved in the movement of because I suppose of her job as a doctor, she didn't get much attention, so she was able to do a lot of helpful things, of carrying messages and all of that type of thing for the leaders. Oh, and after independence, then she was commissioned into the Irish Army, the first female officer to be commissioned to the Irish Army as a medical officer. And she married then later a solicitor. And later in life, in the 1950s, she became very prominent in the fight against TB. And just as today we have the vaccine program going against COVID, she was a pioneer in the BCG vaccination scheme to treat tuberculosis in the east of the country, and so she had a fairly notable life, both in her early days and later on in life. Then she had another career as a leading medical person.
That's very interesting. Yeah, very positive life. You mentioned at the start, Douglas Hyde, the first president of Ireland, was from Roscommon.
Yes.
Can you tell me when was the last time that Roscommon was the county was a majority Irish-speaking county? Do you know that yourself?
A majority-speaking county, I would say it would be in the mid to late 1700s.
Okay, so that'd be...
Yeah. Now, when Douglas Hyde was growing up in French Park, there were people. He got his Irish, or he started getting his love of Irish from some of the locals. So the further west you went in the county towards Ballinadreen and into Mayo, there'd be more and more Irish. But as you came east, the English would be more predominant. But I'd say it was that there'd be a lot of Irish spoken in the late 1700s. Words, when I was growing up, even there was lots of Irish words sprinkled amongst the English language. When you were doing farm work and everything else, there was lots of Irish words, sprinkled. People were saying them automatically, not knowing perhaps that there were Irish words. There were just ones that came down from generation to generation.
And the Famine Trail we have now along the Royal Canal, it goes.
Yeah.
I believe it goes from Strokestown, doesn't it?
From Strokestown to the Custom House. Yeah.
Yeah. You maybe, if you want, you can tell our listeners a bit more about that. If those don't know, and could you? Could you tell me if the people who did that walk were they Irish speakers? Do you know?
That would be 1840,
from
1849, I think it was. That was during the famine period. The ones that came, that famine walk was actually walked by people from Strokestown that were evicted off their lands, and they had to go to Dublin and then to Liverpool and then on to Montreal in what was known as the coffin ships. And that's how the famine walk has come. But I'm sure several other people went in previous generations. But in the 1840s, I would say, the Irish had fairly well. I mean, if I'm looking at documents and so forth from back then, they were all mainly in English. But of course, Irish speakers wouldn't have any need for formal documents back then anyhow, I suppose, because there would be the tenants on land and so forth. So, but the famine museum is in Strokestown, and in the Strokestown Park House, and it was the landlord Dennis Mahan in Strokestown who ordered the removal of all these tenants from his property. And it was cheaper to pay the passage on these very dodgy ships to America than to keep giving them eating soup out of the soup kitchens, if you want to say it that way. So there was something several hundred anyhow were marched from Strokestown along the canal and onto the docks in Dublin, and from there in a coal ship of some kind over to Liverpool, and then on to Quebec, and several of them were lost on the way. There was a report that some of them may have been drowned that one of the ships was sunk, but actually that didn't happen. But the disease was rampant on it, and when they arrived in Canada in Gros Isle, they were quarantined. I mean, that word is back in vogue today, but it happened then too. The Canadians didn't want to let them on shore until they had a lot of them died, and a lot of them. Then there was orphans left who were brought and given to farmers around Canada to help them, and descendants of some of those orphans were back in Strokestown there about 10 years ago, French speaking, with names like Ty and so forth, and Quinn, but French speaking.
And the landlord who owned the land, he was actually killed soon after, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was assassinated in 1847. Yeah, and that eviction process led up to that, definitely. Yes.
And
yeah.
I live near the 12th Lock, on the Royal Canal, and that's part of the Famine Walk now that people can do, going from Strokestown into Dublin city centre. Just we talked a couple of minutes there about the Irish language in Roscommon. Were many of those people who did the walk during the famine, were they Irish speakers, or at that stage would they have been English speakers, or?
I'd say they'd be mainly English speakers.
Okay.
Now, my only knowledge of that is that my great-grandfather would have been born about that time.
Okay.
And I know he was an English speaker. I never met him. Now, he had died before I was born, but from what I heard, he only had these odd words that were used for things for carrying on your back, was known as a paw dog.
Okay.
and if there was a little drain along that you had to jump over, it was called a shaw. These kind of words were dropped into the language, into the everyday language. But they all came, they were all came down from earlier times. So that's. But I wouldn't think there was a. When you look at the census of 1901, that question is there, English or Irish spoken, and there's a certain amount of people that did have Irish, but how fluent it was, or how, I don't know.
Okay, and is it true that the address Douglas Hyde made as minister or as president of Ireland, his first address, that's the only recording we have now of native Roscommon dialect in Irish?
It might be, yeah. Well, I'm not sure. Was there? I don't know if there was a Roscommon dialect. It would be a Connaught dialect, I suppose. As compared to a Donegal or a Crookagina one, Kerry.
Okay.
But I'm not. I never heard that there was a specific Roscommon dialect. But the people he would have learned his Irish from would be of the Mayo, end of the county,
Okay, that's cool. Yeah. I believe you edited a book also about the War of Independence in Roscommon. This is a big question.
Yes, I got involved.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I got involved with that with a lady from Oregon in the United States who came home to find her uncle's her uncle's gravestone, and couldn't find one, because he was the last one of the family that died, and there was no one to put a headstone up for him. So she started gathering information about when he died and what he did and so forth, and that led to a book that she put together, and she would be doing the writing in Oregon, and thanks to the emerging email world of the 1990s and so forth, she was sending the stuff over to me, and I would be checking it and checking place names and looking up information from newspapers and sending back facts to her and so forth. So that was a collaborative effort, and it's all about the 1916 to 1923 period in Roscommon. She called it "Put the Flag a-Flying," and that whole period she has dealt with it in detail, and also gave little pin pictures of all of the volunteers who were involved.
Okay, was there much kind of action in the War of Independence in Roscommon?
Yeah, nothing. 1917, I suppose, would have been a year where there wasn't much action, but there was the voting in the by-election of Count Plunkett for Sinn Féin, which was the first Sinn Féin seat to be won in the British Parliament. Of course, he didn't attend, and that led to actually Bridget Lyons Thornton's uncle, Joe McGuinness, won a by-election in Longford in 1917 as well. And then you had the 1918 election where Sinn Féin swept the boards, you know, in terms of the Irish Parliamentary Party. And the action, if you want to call it that, really was 1920-21, was very, very, I suppose, from an English perspective, Roscommon would be one of the most disturbed counties in the country, as they would describe it. There was a lot of disturbance and a lot of action. By 1919, you see a lot of the British soldiers had come back from World War I, and a lot of them were Roscommon people who had survived and returned to their farms, but also had all the military skills.
All right. And
from World War I. So many of the leaders were ex-sergeants and corporals and so forth from the British Army.
The leaders of the IRA or the British?
Yes. Yeah. No. The leaders of the IRA. Yeah.
That's cool,
yeah.
Oh, that's
yeah,
cool.
because they had come home, and that was that's the state of affairs that they found when they returned. That the promises that they went into the World War I with about getting a free state, wasn't honoured, and so that set the whole thing off.
Very interesting, yeah. As well as being a Roscommon historian, I believe you do some other work for the county in Dublin, don't you?
I'm presently a chairperson of the Roscommon Association in Dublin. Now, county associations were something that came into being in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and they were typically people from the country that came to Dublin for jobs and were working in the civil service or working in all of the stores and in Dublin working on the buses, whatever, the guards and so forth. They only went home about twice a year, I suppose, Christmas and Easter, and maybe for the 2 weeks in the summer. So they were kind of, the whole thing was to gather a group together who had came from a county. It was a networking, kind of association where they were able to have social functions, but they also, somebody coming to Dublin that needed what was known in them days as digs, somewhere to stay, somewhere to live, go and meet somebody. And also, if you were looking for a job, well, somebody in Guineas knew somebody, or somebody in Cleary's, or somebody in Eason's, was sent, and they would help find people jobs. So it was very much a networking situation, which come the 1980s, 1990s, people certainly had cars and were able to go back at weekends. So the need for county associations has certainly almost disappeared. The Roscommon Association has about 20 active members at the moment, and I'm 77 and I'm one of the youngest. So it's really being, I suppose, we're keeping it together for the sake of the whole. We have one of the founders that founded the association back in 1951, Michael Fitzmaurice from Ballinlaw, who is still with us, hale and hearty, at 95. And so we've been in limbo, of course, for the last year and a half now because of COVID. But we have a few we get together about 2 or 3 times a year, and we have an early bird dinner. We don't like being out too late, and so we have a little social life and so forth. But people commute now from Roscommon every day, normal times. So associations isn't that kind of association. Its day is nearly over.
You mentioned a couple of times there transport. How do you think Roscommon is going today in 2021 compared to when you were growing up, Michael, and in more recent decades in general?
Oh, it's completely different. The countryside, the towns are getting bigger, and the country areas of the countryside, the population is decreasing. When I was growing up, I think in my townland, which is there were about 35 people, I think, in about 10 houses maybe, in the townland. Now there's one house with 4 people.
God. Yeah. But people are gathering around the towns a little more. The population has grown up, but it has grown up around Athlone, for example, Carrick and Shannon. Those, in the hinterlands of those towns. That you will find an increase in population because there are factories there and work there and so forth. Some of our listeners may not know this, but part of Athlone is in County Roscommon, isn't it?
Oh yes, on the western side of Athlone, Monksland is the local area that are in. Well, of course, up until 1898, everything west of the Shannon was in Athlone, but then there was some changes made to the borders of the counties in 1898. So a lot of the principal towns, Athlone and Carrick and Shannon is in Leitrim, but there's a big chunk of it on the Roscommon side as well. So it's the metropolis, I suppose, of Carrick and Shannon that reaches into Roscommon and as well as Athlone. But it's a changed county because farming has changed as well. Hardly anybody sows any crops down there anymore. When I was growing up, everybody had oats and barley and wheat and potatoes and vegetables. And my father used to have an agricultural contractor business for hire, where he went out and ploughed and mowed meadow and then had a thrashing machine in the autumn that he went around from house to house, where you separated the grain from the sheaths of corn, of oats and wheat and so forth. So that's a whole that doesn't happen anymore down there. So any cattle rearing now is mainly what and sheep.
And there are bogs still in Roscommon, but I believe that the situation has totally changed years ago. I believe totally changed.
Yeah, the Board Namona started in Mount Dillon, which is on the Longford. It's on the Roscommon side of the Shannon, bordering Longford, in 1951, and I think it's cut its last turf this year or last year. It's closing down because the peat burning station in Lanesborough is closing down, and also in Shannon Bridge in the south of Roscommon on the Offaly border, it closing down as well. So, but the idea is to, I think, to flood the bogs and to make them into wildlife preserves and so forth, and so I'm, as you know, at the moment, Board Namona is trying to bring that about, and hopefully they can create employment for all the people that lost their jobs.
Okay, Mike, to come towards the end of our interview, is there anything else you want to tell our listeners about your work? And if anyone is listening to this podcast from Roscommon or interested in Roscommon, will you tell them how they can buy your book?
Oh, yeah, they can. Well, unfortunately, they cannot buy the actual book because they're all sold out at the moment. So that's not good. But I have put together a digital copy of the book, which can be bought. Well, if they go into my website, they will see details about where to buy the book, and the digital copy. You get a PDF by email. Unfortunately, the hard copies are all gone, but the website is www.roscommonbiography, all one word, .com. So www.roscommonbiography.com.
And will you be ordering any more print copies of it?
No.
Okay.
It's no. Unfortunately not. It doesn't make economic sense to print it again.
Okay, so the book I got off you a few weeks ago was probably one of the last ones, was it?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's the last half a dozen.
God, I'm delighted I got it. So, I was saying to you, it was for my dad for his birthday. My parents have a house. It's outside Castlerea, a summer house. Well, it's not a summer house. It's a house they spend time in. But it's on the road between Ballymoe and Castlerea.
All right.
Clune Rowan. There's actually, I believe, 2 Clune Rowans in Roscommon. There are 2 townlands, but they live on the.
Yeah, there are several townlands of the same name in the county that can be confused. Indeed, yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah. So I'm delighted I got it from my dad for his birthday. Okay, Michael, it's great talking to you. Is there anything else you want to tell our listeners about?
No. I think we've shot the breeze now for a while, and okay. I hope people find out a little bit more about the people and the county, and that the West is still awake, hopefully, and will remain so.